Some cars weren't just mistakes, they were catastrophes on wheels. Design flaws, lawsuits, engineering nightmares, and public outrage pushed these 8 machines straight into the blacklist. Their endings were not quiet retirements, they were executions.
Please support us and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
1958 Buick Limited. The 1958 Buick Limited stands today as one of the most striking cautionary tales in American automotive history, a monument to excess, to optimism colliding with reality, and to the brutal reality of economic downturn. It was a car so large, so heavily chromed, and so wildly extravagant that it represented the apex of 1950s design. But it was also a car so expensive to build, operate, and purchase that it effectively banned itself from the market. Introduced during a recession, the Limited arrived at precisely the wrong moment. After just 1 year, Buick abandoned the model, leaving behind a legacy defined by grandeur, ambition, and economic misfortune. To understand the Limited's fate, one must begin with the culture of the late 1950s. American automakers were caught up in an arms race of size, power, and chrome. Bigger was better. Longer tail fins meant more prestige. Interiors had to be as plush as living rooms. Buick, GM's premium near-luxury division, wanted to reclaim its pre-war reputation for prestige and exclusivity. The answer was the Limited, a resurrected nameplate designed to sit atop Buick's lineup as its ultimate expression of style and status. And in that sense, the Limited delivered. It wasn't merely big, it was enormous. At nearly 19 feet long and weighing over 2 tons, the Limited dominated the road with presence alone. Its rear quarter panel swooped upward in dramatic fashion. Chrome trim covered nearly every edge, crease, and contour, giving the car the reflective sparkle of a rolling mirror. The grille, a massive toothy structure, seemed to stretch across an entire block. The Limited embodied the belief that cars were not just transportation, they were symbols of prosperity, optimism, and American achievement. But beneath the glamorous facade lay problems, structural, economic, and cultural. The Limited was introduced during the 1958 recession, one of the harshest economic downturns of the post-war era. Unemployment spiked, consumer confidence plunged, and families suddenly became far more cautious with their money. Large luxury cars, with their price tags and operating costs, instantly became symbols of excess many buyers found embarrassing or impractical. The Limited in particular was devastatingly expensive to own. Its massive size required a large V8 engine, and while Buick's engine was powerful, it consumed fuel at a shocking rate. Drivers lucky to see double-digit miles per gallon usually did so only with feather-footed driving. With gas prices climbing and incomes falling, the Limited became an unrealistic indulgence. Even loyal Buick owners hesitated to make the jump to such an extravagant flagship. Beyond fuel costs, the Limited also suffered from the broader design problems associated with the 1958 GM lineup. That year, GM embraced what critics later called chrome overload. The Limited, positioned at the top, featured the most excess. Its styling was polarizing. Some loved the drama and ornamentation, while others felt it was gaudy and overdone. Market trends were already beginning to shift toward cleaner, sleeker lines, something the Limited completely ignored. Customers were becoming wary of cars that seemed like caricatures of luxury, and the Limited's flamboyance made it an easy target. Dealers struggled to sell them. Buyers who might have once purchased a top-line Buick now hesitated, afraid of the cost and the image. The Limited's base price, far above other Buick models, put it uncomfortably close to Cadillacs, which had stronger prestige and richer buyers. Why buy a Buick that pretended to be a Cadillac when one could buy the real thing for only slightly more? Buick had accidentally positioned the Limited in a no-man's land, too expensive for its traditional market and not prestigious enough for the luxury buyers it aimed to attract. The result was predictable. Sales collapsed. Buick moved only a limited number of limiteds, and the model ended in humiliation after its single 1958 model year. It wasn't discontinued because Buick lacked interest in high-end cars. It was discontinued because the market rejected the idea entirely. The Limited became a symbol of everything that went wrong with Detroit's obsession with size and chrome at the exact moment Americans needed practicality and affordability. Yet today, the 1958 Buick Limited has achieved something of a legendary status. Time has a way of reframing failures, especially those related to style. What was once mocked as excessive is now celebrated as bold. Enthusiasts admire the Limited for its unapologetic extravagance, for being the final, magnificent gasp of the chrome era before the restrained 1960s arrived. Collectors seek them out precisely because they are rare, extravagant, and emblematic of a bygone mindset. Ironically, the qualities that made the Limited fail in the showroom are the same qualities that make it valuable today. But historically, the Limited remains a lesson in market timing and corporate strategy. Buick misread the economy, misread buyer sentiment, and misread the direction automotive design was headed. They built a masterpiece of excess in a year when customers wanted moderation. They offered a gas-guzzling giant when gas anxiety was rising. They created an ultra-expensive Buick at a moment when middle-class confidence was evaporating. The 1958 Buick Limited was, in every measurable way, too big to live. It demanded too much fuel, too much money, too much confidence in a good economy. Customers' wallets, already battered by a recession, delivered a clear verdict: no. Buick pulled the plug after a single run, leaving behind one of the most spectacular one-year wonders in American automotive history. In the end, the Limited's legacy is a striking mixture of beauty and failure. It was not a bad car, far from it. It was well-built, stunning in presence, and technologically competent. Its downfall was not its engineering, but the world it entered. It serves as a reminder that even magnificent machines can collapse under the weight of economic pressure and changing tastes. The 1958 Buick Limited represents the end of an era, one that burned brightly, brilliantly, and briefly before reality forced American automakers to rethink what luxury should mean. 1960 Plymouth Valiant Prototype. The birth of the 1960 Plymouth Valiant is one of the strangest, least discussed, and most dramatic design sagas in American automotive history. The car that finally reached showrooms was already unconventional. Sharp creases, odd proportions, and a quirky, almost European personality. But the truth behind its earliest prototype goes far deeper into the bizarre. Before the Valiant became the compact car America knew, its very first clay model was so shockingly unattractive, so incoherent in design, that Chrysler executives demanded it be destroyed immediately. No photographs, no documentation, no chance of it ever resurfacing. A complete, scorched earth reset. It was, in all but name, a design that was banned before it even left the styling studio. To understand why the original prototype met such a dramatic fate, one has to look at the late 1950s landscape. The American compact car revolution was coming, and Chrysler, perennially the third largest automaker, was desperate to keep pace with Ford's Falcon and Chevrolet's upcoming Corvair. But Chrysler was in turmoil. Styling direction under Virgil Exner had reached both its peak and its implosion. Exner, architect of the forward look, had revolutionized Chrysler's design language earlier in the decade. But by 1959, the fins were too big, the chrome too heavy, and the company's finances too fragile to sustain risky projects. The Valiant was supposed to save Chrysler, an all-new compact with modern engineering, a unibody structure, and advanced packaging. But Exner's team faced an impossible challenge: create a car that was small, stylish, and futuristic, all while competing against Ford and GM's budgets that dwarfed Chrysler's. Under pressure, rushed, and divided by conflicting stylistic philosophies, the design studio delivered something that stunned leadership, but not in a good way. The first full-scale clay model of the Valiant looked, according to surviving accounts, like a distorted caricature of Exner's ideas. Insiders described it as overwrought, bloated in strange places, and a compact car that looked swollen rather than sleek. Fins were present, but awkward. The proportions were bizarre, heavy at the rear, narrow at the front, with exaggerated character lines that gave it a misshapen, almost cartoonish appearance. It had none of the elegance of Chrysler's forward look, nor the cleanliness that a compact car needed. When Chrysler's executive committee arrived for the evaluation, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Some chuckled, some grimaced, others stared in disbelief. The design violated every principle that the compact market demanded. It was neither simple nor tasteful, and it certainly wasn't aerodynamic. Worse, it bordered on absurdity. Within minutes, the verdict came down: destroy it, now. They didn't want dealers to see it. They didn't want rival companies to leak it. They didn't even want their own employees laughing about it. The clay model was ordered wiped out, literally scraped back into a pile of unrecognizable material. Chrysler wanted no photographic evidence, no blueprints, no chance that the world would know how badly the first attempt at their compact car had gone. This internal execution of a prototype speaks volumes about Chrysler's corporate climate at the time. The company was terrified of embarrassment. Its finances were shaky, its future uncertain, and its reputation fragile. A disastrous design leak could have made the already struggling automaker look foolish at the very moment it needed credibility. More importantly, Chrysler recognized something that many automakers of the era didn't. The compact car buyer was practical, price-sensitive, and extremely attuned to looks. If the car looked strange, people would reject it instantly. So the design studio, humiliated but motivated, went back to the drawing board. What followed was an intense, all-hands-on-deck redesign effort. Engineers and designers worked simultaneously, blending artistry with necessity. The result was the Valiant that debuted for 1960, still unusual, still very Exner, but no longer grotesque. It featured crisp lines, a strong thrust-forward stance, modest fins, and a unique identity that set it apart from the boxy Falcon and the rear-engine Corvair. Chrysler marketed the Valiant as smart, modern, and bold, a kind of compact car that refused to be boring. And in a way, that distinctiveness worked. While not universally loved, the production Valiant avoided the catastrophic reception its prototype surely would have received. Buyers found it interesting, different, and surprisingly well-engineered, especially with the rugged, long-lasting slant-six engine. The Valiant became a modest sales success and helped stabilize Chrysler in a turbulent era. What makes the destroyed prototype so fascinating today is that the incident represents a rare moment when an automaker willingly erased its own history. Ford and GM preserved countless failed concepts, documenting each misstep. Chrysler, by contrast, treated the original Valiant clay like radioactive waste, too dangerous to keep around. The company's leaders understood that the compact market would judge harshly, and that an ugly design wouldn't just fail, it would become a laughingstock at the worst possible moment. The story also highlights the delicate balance between innovation and restraint. Exner's team was bursting with creativity, but their first attempt had strayed too far from practicality. The compact buyer wanted economy, not extravagance. They wanted familiarity, not radical shapes. The prototype, wild, excessive, malformed, showed what happened when Chrysler tried to force a futuristic vision onto a market that demanded modesty. Today, the destroyed clay model has become something of a phantom legend in automotive history. Only verbal descriptions remain, passed down by designers who saw it with their own eyes.
Some recall it as monstrous. Others call it comedic. All agree that Chrysler made the right decision. When the 1960 Valiant finally reached showrooms, it was far from perfect, but compared to the banned prototype, it looked like a masterpiece. The redesign saved Chrysler from embarrassment, saved the Valiant from a disastrous launch, and ensured that one of America's most important compact cars didn't begin life as a punchline. In the end, the original Valiant prototype lives on only as a myth, a reminder that sometimes the greatest failures in automotive history are the ones the public never gets to see.
1959 Chrysler New Yorker Flamingo. Few cars in American history have fallen from grace as spectacularly or as strangely as the 1959 Chrysler New Yorker Flamingo, a pastel-colored, gadget-laden showpiece whose most infamous feature became its undoing, a rotating driver's seat designed to gently swivel the driver outward for graceful entry and exit. It was supposed to embody futuristic convenience. Instead, it became one of the most dangerous mechanical gimmicks ever fitted to a production-intended American automobile. Within months, the feature malfunctioned so catastrophically that Chrysler not only halted production, but reportedly buried the entire project in corporate silence. The Flamingo should have been a triumph. Chrysler styling chief Virgil Exner was deep into his forward-look era, an era of sweeping fins, long horizontal lines, and an obsession with space-age glamour. The Flamingo was intended to represent the apex of Chrysler's 1959 luxury philosophy. Bold colors, deep chrome, dramatic tail fins, and an interior that blended comfort with Jetsons-worthy futurism. It wasn't officially a separate model, but rather a concept-turned limited production idea based on the New Yorker, Chrysler's flagship V8 cruiser. Its most prominent calling card was the rotating seat. Chrysler engineers imagined it as a revolutionary convenience feature. The driver would open the door, and the front seat, mounted on a powered swivel base, would turn outward by 40 to 45 degrees, making entry effortless. When the door closed, the seat smoothly pivoted back into the driving position. In theory, it was genius. In practice, it was a mechanical nightmare. The system relied on a series of motors, springs, limit switches, and alignment sensors that were expected to function seamlessly in an era when electrical reliability was still hit or miss. Test benches didn't replicate real-world road shock, temperature changes, or the wear that came with daily use. Problems emerged almost immediately. The most catastrophic issue was seat rotation mid-drive. The same component that told the seat it was safe to pivot had a habit of failing, sometimes due to vibration, sometimes due to wiring faults, or sometimes simply because early automotive electronics were notoriously fragile. When the sensor failed, the motor could activate at random. Drivers approaching a corner could suddenly feel the seat lurch to the side, swinging them halfway toward the door. It was startling, disorienting, and in some cases outright dangerous. Chrysler engineers recorded incidents where test drivers lost control because the rotating base broke free of its locked position. In at least 2 test accounts, the seat pivoted just enough to force the driver to grab the steering wheel at an awkward angle. Mid-turn, that moment of instability was all it took to cause loss of control. Accidents followed. Chrysler tried to address the malfunction with stronger locking mechanisms and additional safety switches, but no fix proved consistent. Every attempt to refine the system introduced new problems. The lock could jam, leaving the seat stuck at an angle. The motor could burn out. Wiring shorts could cause the seat to twitch unpredictably. When prototypes reached early demonstrations and dealer previews, word spread quickly, not publicly, but through terrified Chrysler staff, that the Flamingo's rotating seat might be beyond salvaging. Chrysler executives, already shaken by reports of unexpected seat movement during controlled tests, realized any production of the Flamingo could expose the company to massive liability. The Flamingo was quietly canceled. Engineers dismantled prototypes. Concept cars were hidden away or scrapped. Chrysler executives pretended the project never existed. Although Chrysler later offered a far simpler manual swivel seat on some 1960 to 1962 models, it was nothing like the Flamingo's elaborate powered design, and it came only after rigorous redesign. The Flamingo's rotating seat never made it into full-scale production, ensuring that only a handful of prototypes and even fewer verified survivors ever existed. But its story is remembered within automotive history circles for what it represents: the danger of innovation outpacing engineering reality. The 1950s were an era of wild optimism in American automotive design. Automakers chased style and novelty with almost reckless enthusiasm. Push-button transmissions, retractable roofs, swivel-in dashboards, and endless chrome flourishes. In this creative frenzy, ideas often leapt ahead of practicality. The Flamingo was one such idea, a beautiful experiment undone by the limits of the era's technology. In retrospect, the Flamingo wasn't a bad car. It was a good car burdened by a bad idea. Its V8 power, its bold pink paint options, its luxurious interior, they all showcased Chrysler's desire to build something remarkable. But when your main selling feature becomes a mid-turn ejection device, even the best styling and engineering can't save you. Today, the 1959 Chrysler New Yorker Flamingo stands as a cautionary tale, a reminder that innovation requires restraint, that convenience must be backed by reliability, and that even the most exciting concept can die in shame if its centerpiece is catastrophically flawed. It is a footnote in Chrysler history, but a fascinating one, a perfect symbol of the decade's ambition, excess, and sometimes dangerous imagination. And above all else, it remains the only American luxury car whose driver's seat tried to quit mid-turn.
1963 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt Street Version. In the early 1960s, Detroit's automakers were locked in a horsepower arms race that bordered on madness. Chevrolet was stuffing ever larger engines into mid-size cars. Pontiac was pushing performance limits on the street and the strip. Chrysler was building brutal 413 and 426 max wedge monsters that lived and breathed quarter-mile domination. And Ford, once considered the more conservative giant, decided it had enough. The response was the 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt, a factory-built drag weapon so powerful, so stripped down, and so single-minded that it became one of the most feared cars ever unleashed by an American automaker. But behind the Thunderbolt's legend lies a lesser-known chapter. The abandoned 1963 prototype street version, a car Ford ultimately deemed too dangerous, too unruly, and too uncontrollable for ordinary roads. It was a violent creature, a car whose very existence threatened Ford with lawsuits, injuries, and headline-grabbing disaster. And so, in a rare moment of corporate restraint, Ford banned the project before a single street-ready unit reached customers. This is the story of the Thunderbolt that never was. By 1963, Ford was eager to dominate NHRA superstock drag racing, where bragging rights were worth millions in marketing. The company's engineers at the Experimental Vehicles Garage knew exactly what weapon they needed. Take the compact, lightweight Fairlane body and stuff inside it the 427 cubic inch, 425 horsepower race engine used successfully in Ford's full-size Galaxies. The idea was simple: power to weight equals victory. But the execution bordered on insanity. The 427 high-riser engine was never designed for street manners. Its massive intake, aggressive camshaft, sky-high compression, and violent torque delivery made it a temperamental beast even in full-size cars. In a Fairlane, the engine bay wasn't even big enough. Engineers had to carve out parts of the shock towers to shoehorn the motor in. The Thunderbolt was born in fire, fiberglass, and brute force. It was the blueprint for the stillborn street version, and the reason that version would later be killed. Once Ford realized how much publicity the drag car would bring, some executives floated the idea of a mild street edition, something slightly more civilized, slightly more comfortable, but still heroic enough to turn the Fairlane into Ford's street performance flagship. Tone the engine down, slightly. Add steel bumpers back. Reinstate regular bucket seats. Offer a full interior and normal glass. Give it mufflers that wouldn't trigger a police sting. Keep the spirit of the Thunderbolt, but make it tolerable on real pavement. On paper, this seemed like a marketing dream. Muscle car fever was starting to take hold. The Pontiac GTO would soon prove there was enormous demand for street performance mid-size cars. Ford wanted in, early. A civilian Thunderbolt could have been Ford's ultimate head start in the muscle car era. But then, testing began. Even the gentler prototype street versions were barely drivable. The 427 engine didn't like idling under 1200 RPM. It bucked in traffic. It overheated. It loaded up spark plugs. It drowned carburetors and fuel. But those were minor inconveniences compared to what happened when the driver stepped even halfway into the throttle. The engine produced more torque than the Fairlane chassis could physically manage. Test drivers described the car as a hand grenade with wheels, a car that tried to rotate you into oncoming traffic, and barely directional. Chassis flex so violent, the windshield distorted under load. Engine torque twisted the unibody so hard that weld points creaked audibly. Front-end lift that made steering almost optional. At full throttle, the nose rose like a speedboat, sending the front wheels light and directionally unstable. Wheel hop capable of destroying driveline components. Test journals mentioned shattered U-joints and cracked tail shafts after repeated launches. Brakes incapable of stopping a 425 horsepower monster from high speeds. Ford engineers were terrified that releasing this car to the public would invite catastrophe the first time a driver hit 110 miles per hour and needed to stop in under a mile. Oversteer that bordered on suicidal. The short wheelbase plus massive torque equaled a recipe for snap oversteer the moment a driver lifted off the throttle. In one infamous test, the rear axle literally walked sideways out of alignment under full load. Engineers had to tow the prototype back to Dearborn. The conclusion was obvious. No amount of detuning could make the Thunderbolt a safe civilian car. Internal memos from late 1963 made it painfully clear. The Fairlane platform cannot safely accommodate a 427 high-performance engine for street operation. Ford's legal department panicked at the thought of a customer, some 18-year-old hero, driving one of these onto a public highway. They were already fighting safety concerns around full-size cars with far less power. A street Thunderbolt would be a litigation time bomb. So Ford did the unthinkable in the golden age of horsepower expansion. They banned the project. The planned street version was canceled before a single unit reached a showroom. The only Thunderbolts Ford ever built were race-only cars. 100 brutal fiberglass-heavy Fairlanes designed exclusively to win the 1964 NHRA season. The street dream was dead. Had Ford continued, the street Thunderbolt could have rewritten muscle car history. It would have predated the Pontiac GTO as America's first true factory hot rod. It would have turned the Fairlane into Ford's street performance flagship. It might have set the stage for Ford, not GM, to define the entire muscle car era. Raw power is useless if the car cannot safely contain it. The Thunderbolt's danger was not theoretical. It was physical, structural, and immediate. And Ford's engineers, after watching their prototype twist, hop, and nearly eject drivers, knew they had crossed a line. The legacy of the Thunderbolt that never lived. The 1963 street version Thunderbolt exists today only in rumors, internal memos, and the memories of Ford's engineering team. While the race Thunderbolt became a legend, the terror of the quarter mile, the street edition became an alternate history footnote. Its cancellation stands as one of the rare moments when a Detroit automaker admitted a simple truth. Just because you can build something doesn't mean the world is ready for it. The Thunderbolt streetcar was too wild, too violent, and too uncontrollable for public roads. It was a dragster wearing a thin disguise, a loaded weapon disguised as a mid-size sedan. In killing it, Ford saved lives, lawsuits, and a public relations nightmare. Yet the mythology endures. In the car culture imagination, the canceled Thunderbolt remains an icon of forbidden power. The muscle car that would have been too dangerous to survive.
1958 Lincoln Continental Mark III. The late 1950s were a fever dream of American excess. Chrome was thicker than armor plating, tail fins soared like aircraft wings, and every automaker tried to outdo the others in size, scale, and spectacle. Into this world stepped the 1958 Lincoln Continental Mark III, a rolling monument to gigantism so extreme that even Detroit's competitors quietly whispered, "This is too much." And, in many ways, it was. The Mark III became the symbol of a company that had pushed luxury engineering to its breaking point. It was enormous, breathtakingly expensive, shockingly heavy, prone to mechanical overwhelm, and ultimately doomed. Dealers complained, customers hesitated, Ford accountants panicked. Within a short span, the model was discontinued, scrapped, and quietly erased from showroom strategy. This is the story of the Continental that collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, literally and figuratively. A car born in the high-chrome arms race. By 1958, Lincoln was desperate to outclass Cadillac. The luxury competition was a matter of pride, not just profit. So Ford poured staggering amounts of money into creating the ultimate prestige vehicle. The logic seemed simple. If Cadillac was big, Lincoln would be bigger. If Cadillac was luxurious, Lincoln would be opulent. If Cadillac was bold, Lincoln would be astronomical. The result was the 1958 Continental Mark III, a machine that belonged less on a road and more on a battleship registry. A giant in every sense. The Mark III was obscene in scale. Length, over 229 inches. Width, nearly 80 inches. Weight, almost 5,300 pounds, heavier than some full-size pickup trucks of its era. Engine, Ford's biggest ever at the time, a 430 cubic inch MEL V8 designed to move all that steel. The car was so big that Ford engineers had to build it on the all-new unibody X-frame platform, a structural experiment that combined the weaknesses of both body-on-frame and unibody. The result was a car that was hard to maneuver, hard to stop, hard to service, and extremely hard to sell. But the most damning issue of all wasn't merely its size, it was the mechanical stress that came with moving that much mass. Crushed by its own weight. Despite its massive 430 V8, the Mark III struggled to propel itself gracefully. The engine worked tirelessly just to get the car moving, and the brakes, massive drums on all four corners, were hopelessly overwhelmed. Drivers noted a terrifying pattern. City driving? Fine. Light cruising? Fine. Hard braking from 50 miles per hour, smell of hot metal. Hard braking from 70 miles per hour, smoke and fade. A second hard stop? Dangerously reduced braking force. The Mark III was simply too heavy for the braking technology of the 1950s. As automotive journalists of the time said, with only half a joke, you brake early and pray the light stays green. Dealers soon reported complaints of brake fade on long downhill grades, softening pedal feel, overheated drums that warped, parking brakes that couldn't hold the car on inclines.
Lincoln's flagship luxury car couldn't reliably stop itself. Too big to park, too big to own. Weight wasn't the Mark III's only problem. Its sheer physical size presented daily challenges. 1. Parking? Good luck. The car barely fit into most 1950s garages. Parallel parking was a test of patience and geometry. 2. Fuel consumption? Devastating. The giant 430 V8 drank premium fuel at a rate that made even wealthy buyers reconsider. 3. Maintenance? A nightmare. Many mechanics didn't even have lifts rated for a 5,300-pound car. 4. Build quality? Inconsistent at best. The complex unibody construction made repairs extremely expensive and sometimes structurally questionable. Lincoln had built a luxury tank at the worst possible time. Too expensive for the market. With its massive size, elaborate engineering, and massive factory investment, the Mark III was financially catastrophic. Ford needed to sell big numbers to recoup costs. Instead, they sold barely enough to keep the line limping forward. Dealers complained loudly. Customers love the look, but hate the price. It's too big. People are intimidated. These brakes are a liability. We can't keep them moving off the lot. The recession of 1958, one of the sharpest economic declines of the post-war era, made everything worse. Buyers tightened their wallets, opting for smaller, cheaper, more manageable cars. The Mark III was the wrong car at the worst time. The dealers versus Ford, a civil war. Ford had spent millions launching the Mark III, but the dealership network was having none of it. Flooring costs were high, repairs were slow, warranty claims, especially for brake issues, were expensive. Inventory piled up, customer interest dropped. Soon the message became impossible to ignore. Kill this car, we can't sell it. Ford, facing escalating losses, listened. The quiet death of a giant. By mid-1958, Ford executives realized the Mark III was an unsustainable financial sinkhole. It cost too much to build, too much to service, and too much to warranty. The engineering mistakes were baked into the car's structure. No quick fix could save it. Production was cut early. Investment in the platform was canceled. The Mark III name survived in future models, but the 1958 behemoth was quietly retired, almost swept under the rug. Ford needed to distance themselves from the disaster. Re-evaluation and redemption. Interestingly, decades later, the 1958 Mark III found a cult following. Today's collectors appreciate its absurd size, elaborate styling, and unapologetic presence. It is one of the loudest symbols of 1950s American excess, almost a caricature of the era. But back in 1958, it was a technological overreach, a luxury car that failed to understand its own limitations. It collapsed under its own weight, financially, mechanically, and historically. Final reflection. The car that went too far. The 1958 Lincoln Continental Mark III will forever be remembered as too heavy to perform, too expensive to build, too large to live in a changing economy, too flawed to be saved. It is a cautionary tale of ambition without restraint, a reminder that bigger is not always better, and that even the grandest engineering visions can crumble when physics, economics, and real-world practicality catch up. Lincoln aimed for the stars, but in 1958, it built a planet, beautiful, massive, and ultimately impossible to keep in orbit.
1969 Pontiac Grand Prix Hearst Concept. In the late 1960s, Pontiac was Detroit's undisputed king of cool, bold, rebellious, and willing to build cars that other GM divisions wouldn't dare touch.
From the GTO to the Firebird, Pontiac routinely poked the corporate bear, stretching rules and bending limits in the name of speed. But even for Pontiac, the 1969 Grand Prix Hearst concept was a step too far. It was wild, loud, and unapologetically extreme, a perfect storm of performance, styling, and marketing bravado. Not because it wasn't fast, not because customers didn't want it, not because Pontiac lacked the engineering expertise. The Hearst Grand Prix died because GM Corporate panicked. At the very moment Pontiac wanted to launch its loudest, boldest luxury performance coupe, GM feared federal regulators, emissions laws, and political heat. So the company quietly banned the project from inside its own walls. This is the story of the Grand Prix that never got to tear up the streets, a machine killed not by failure, but by fear. A perfect partnership. Pontiac meets Hearst. To understand the magnitude of the cancellation, you need to understand the players. Pontiac, 1960s. A division known for rebellion, street performance, and visual swagger. Its engineers, John DeLorean among them, believed in stretching legal limits, not shrinking from them. Hearst Performance, a company that turned muscle cars into legends. Their work included the Hearst Olds, Hemi Under Glass, Ramrod Oldsmobiles, some of the greatest shifters ever built. Hearst was flamboyant, fearless, and obsessed with speed. Pairing Pontiac and Hearst was like combining gasoline and fireworks. Something explosive was guaranteed. So in 1969, the two forces secretly collaborated on the Hearst-tuned Grand Prix built on the newly introduced long-wheelbase G-body. It would have been the most powerful, most visually aggressive, and most exclusive Grand Prix ever built. The Hearst Grand Prix, what they planned to build. The details of the concept have long circulated through enthusiast circles, and the design intent can be reconstructed from internal memos, prototypes, and Hearst's own marketing sketches. The Hearst Grand Prix was designed to feature 1. A monster engine. Pontiac wanted to drop in an upgraded high-output V8, possibly the 428HO, or even a version of the Ram Air 4. Hearst wanted it louder, meaner, and tuned for straight-line dominance. 2. A radical Hearst bodywork. This included a white and gold paint scheme, hood scoops, unique Hearst badging, a revised front fascia with more aggressive intake openings, air management tweaks for brake cooling. The car looked like a Pontiac that had been dipped in pure ego. 3. A signature Hearst interior. This meant gold accents, performance instrumentation, a Hearst dual-gate shifter, optional bucket seats and center console setup. The interior would scream luxury meets drag strip. 4. Hearst suspension and brake upgrades. Handling improvements were necessary to rein in the power. Hearst planned revised shocks, springs, and sway bars, making the concept more of a grand touring weapon than a luxury cruiser. In short, Pontiac was about to build a full-size muscle coupe, a heavyweight bruiser with a Hearst pedigree. But then came the moment that killed the dream. GM's corporate panic attack. While Pontiac and Hearst quietly prepared the concept, GM's upper management caught wind of the project, and what they saw horrified them. Why? Because 1969 was the beginning of the federal crackdown. Between 1967 and 1970, Washington passed regulations that terrified automakers. Emissions standards were tightening. Insurance rates for muscle cars were skyrocketing. Safety regulations were expanding. Noise restrictions were being discussed. Politicians were targeting high-performance vehicles specifically. GM executives believed, rightly or wrongly, that launching a louder, more powerful, flashier Grand Prix with Hearst branding would bring federal heat directly onto the corporation. Pontiac, they feared, was becoming too bold for its own good. Internal politics. Who could say no? GM had a strict internal hierarchy designed to keep divisions in line, and in 1969, that hierarchy was brutal. Chevrolet was the golden child. Oldsmobile was the technological experimenter. Cadillac catered to wealthy, mature buyers. Pontiac was allowed to be sporty, but only within boundaries. The Hearst Grand Prix crossed every boundary. It was too powerful, too loud, too flamboyant, too likely to attract political backlash. GM feared the car would serve as Exhibit A in hearings about muscle car regulation. So an order came down from above, quietly, firmly, and without appeal. This car will not be produced. Pontiac was furious, Hearst was furious, but both were ultimately powerless. The car that was ready, but never born. Only one or two true prototypes, more accurately test mules, are believed to have been built. Photos are scarce, and GM ordered much of the material destroyed. Hearst was forced to abandon the project immediately. Pontiac engineers later admitted the decision came down to fear of federal emissions penalties, fear of noise level violations, fear of being labeled irresponsible, fear that Pontiac's rebellious image was becoming a corporate liability, fear that the Hearst Grand Prix would undermine GM's strategy of moving toward more efficient, more regulated vehicles. Never mind that customers would have loved it. Never mind that the Hearst Olds was selling well. Never mind that the Grand Prix line itself was booming. Corporate fear trumped marketing reality. The legacy. A muscle car ghost. Today, the 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix Hearst concept is one of the great what-ifs of American muscle car history. It was a luxury performance coupe before such a class officially existed. A perfect blend of Pontiac aggression and Hearst showmanship. A machine that could have redefined the Grand Prix brand. A halo car that would have dominated the early 1970s muscle car conversation. Instead, it became a ghost, rumored, whispered about, and reconstructed only through fragments. Pontiac fans see it as the moment GM corporate strangled the division's creativity. Hearst fans see it as the moment a potential legend was erased. Historians see it as a case study in how regulation reshaped Detroit. It's the muscle car that died before it could shake the earth. Final reflection. The car fear killed. The 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix Hearst concept wasn't canceled because it failed. It was canceled because it succeeded too well. It was too powerful for a nervous GM, too loud for an increasingly regulated America, too bold for a corporation terrified of federal scrutiny, too rebellious for a system that demanded conformity. GM didn't kill the concept because it couldn't work. They killed it because they feared what would happen if it did. And so the Hearst Grand Prix lives only in legend, a car that promised greatness but was defeated by corporate anxiety, political wins, and the end of the muscle era. It stands as a reminder of a short-lived moment when Pontiac dreamed large and GM told them to stop dreaming.
1974 Plymouth Satellite Sebring Plus, canceled by emissions. The high-performance Mopar that never escaped the regulations. The 1974 Plymouth Satellite Sebring Plus was supposed to be Plymouth's answer to a problem that every American performance division faced in the early 1970s. How do you keep the muscle car spirit alive when the law is strangling the engines? Plymouth believed it had a solution, a high-performance V8 package that would restore a pulse to the fading satellite lineup.
But the political, environmental, and corporate winds of 1974 were blowing in the exact opposite direction. What began as a hopeful return to form ended up becoming one of Plymouth's most notorious ghost cars, canceled before the public ever had a chance to see what it could do. To understand why the project died, you first have to understand the times. The early 1970s were a nightmare for automakers. The Clean Air Act of 1970 had already forced engineers to rethink combustion, reduce emissions, and detune engines that had previously been celebrated for their brute force. The aftershock of the 1973 oil crisis only made it worse. Buyers wanted economy, lawmakers wanted cleaner air, and insurance companies wanted lower horsepower. That left performance cars in a shrinking, suffocating corner. The satellite Sebring Plus, meant for 1974, stepped into this minefield at the worst moment. Plymouth originally planned to introduce a stronger V8 option to the Sebring Plus, something that would revive the spirit of the late 1960s Roadrunners and GTXs. It wasn't going to be a tire-shredding monster, but it was supposed to retain some dignity, enough horsepower to matter, enough torque to remind buyers that Mopar still cared about performance. Internally, engineers worked with a detuned version of the 360 and even explored limited adaptations of larger displacements. But the problem wasn't engineering skill. It was that the rules were changing faster than Plymouth's prototypes could evolve. By the time test engines were running, federal emission standards for 1974 had tightened again, demanding catalytic converters, leaner mixtures, and major reductions in hydrocarbons and nitrogen oxides. The high-performance package simply could not comply without becoming painfully slow. Plymouth found themselves trapped in a paradox. If they added the performance parts, the emissions skyrocketed. If they tuned them out, the car performed no better than a base sedan. The proposed 1974 Sebring Plus performance package became quite literally illegal on paper before it even hit the road. Plymouth's management tried to salvage the project. Engineers experimented with exhaust gas recirculation, retarded timing, redesigned cylinder heads, and modified carburetors, but each revision only dug the grave deeper. The more they tried to pass emissions, the more power they lost. And by early 1974, the question inside Chrysler headquarters was no longer, how do we make this work, but why are we wasting money on this? The corporate appetite for risk had evaporated. The company was already financially shaky, preparing for years of losses, and executives feared launching a performance trim that would instantly attract government scrutiny. Then came the reality check. Insurance companies refused to classify the planned model at a normal rate. Any high-performance designation triggered premiums so high that the car would have been unsellable to its target buyers. Even if Plymouth somehow managed to pass emissions, the financial pressures would choke the car at the dealership level. So the order came down. Cancel it completely. No announcement, no press release, no images, no brochures. The 1974 Satellite Sebring Plus high-performance version simply evaporated. For collectors today, the story is almost mythical. Some enthusiasts claim that a few prototypes existed. Others believe only development engines and engineering notes were produced. What is certain, though, is that Plymouth intended the car to be part of a final stand, a last gasp of performance before the full transition into an era dominated by economy cars, emissions technology, and shrinking horsepower. The cancellation was more than a product decision. It was a symbolic moment for Plymouth. In many ways, the death of the 1974 Satellite Sebring Plus performance project marked the final collapse of the muscle car dream within the brand. Plymouth would never again build anything resembling the pure, unapologetic powerhouses of the late 60s. The Roadrunner and Duster would limp along in detuned, compromised forms, but the fire was gone. Federal rules, market forces, and economic fears had cornered the engineers into surrender. Looking back, the 1974 Satellite Sebring Plus Ghost model represents an entire era's struggle. It's not remembered because it thrilled drivers. Nobody outside Chrysler ever drove one. It's remembered because of what it symbolizes, a car undone not by mechanical flaws, but by regulations, timing, and a political climate that made performance a dirty word. It was the muscle car that never got the chance to fight, strangled before it could breathe. Today, enthusiasts look at the 1974 Satellite and wonder what could have been. Could it have revived Plymouth's performance image? Could it have given the brand a transitional model to help bridge the gap into the coming decades? Probably not, but the possibility remains a bittersweet reminder of how rapidly the automotive landscape changed in the 1970s. In the end, though, the high-performance 1974 Plymouth Satellite Sebring Plus never existed, but its cancellation tells a deeper story. It reflects the collision between ambition and regulation, between horsepower and policy, between the dreams of engineers and the realities of the world they lived in. It was a car built on hope, buried by law, and remembered as one of Plymouth's most intriguing automotive what-ifs.
1949 Oldsmobile Futuramic 98 convertible, scrapped after frame failures. The beautiful drop top that fell apart under its own weight. The 1949 Oldsmobile Futuramic 98 convertible should have been one of the crown jewels of post-war American luxury. The Futuramic line symbolized the optimistic future of transportation after years of wartime austerity. Sleek styling, modern proportions, and Oldsmobile's forward-thinking engineering philosophy made the 4998 look like a bold step into a new era. On paper, it was everything a premium American convertible should be: elegant, powerful, comfortable, and loaded with style. But behind the glamour was a structural flaw so severe that Oldsmobile ended up killing the model quietly and prematurely. The problem wasn't cosmetic or mechanical. It was existential. The car simply could not handle being a convertible. Its frame flexed, twisted, and cracked under normal use, turning a luxury cruiser into a structural liability. Had Oldsmobile issued a formal recall, the embarrassment would have echoed across the entire GM empire. Instead, they took the quieter path: stop production, stop talking about it, and hope buyers forget. To understand the disaster, you have to understand the era. In the late 1940s, America was hungry for convertibles. Returning soldiers wanted freedom, luxury, and style, something exciting after years of rationing and war. GM's designers rushed to meet demand, often pushing the limits of body engineering in the process. The 1949 Oldsmobile 98, with its new Futuramic design language, was part of GM's grand post-war reintroduction. Built on the new C-body platform, the 98 was heavier, wider, and more luxurious than before. But the engineering team failed to account for one thing: the forces inflicted on a large, heavy car once you remove the roof. A convertible has to be reinforced. Without a roof to act as a structural backbone, the frame must resist torsion and bending on its own. Oldsmobile did add reinforcements, but they were not enough, nowhere close. The 1949 Futuramic 98 convertible weighed nearly 2 tons and was powered by the high-compression rocket V8, one of the strongest engines available at the time. Every time the car accelerated hard, every time it hit a pothole, and every time it leaned into a turn, the frame absorbed enormous stress, and it wasn't built for it. Owners began reporting problems almost immediately. At first, the signs were subtle: creaks, groans, and mild door misalignments. Then the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Doors refused to close properly. The gaps between body panels widened until you could see daylight. In some cars, the windshield frame tilted slightly out of alignment, making the top nearly impossible to latch. The convertible body didn't just flex, it distorted permanently. The rocker sills, which were supposed to provide rigidity, began to crack from stress. Floor pans buckled. Dealers saw cars come in so twisted that the weather stripping no longer touched the frame. This was not a small issue. This was a structural collapse happening in slow motion. GM engineers examined early returned cars and quickly realized the truth. The convertible version of the 1949-98 was fundamentally flawed. No amount of warranty repair could fix a frame that was bending under its own weight. Strengthening it would require a redesign, heavier steel, improved bracing, and major changes to the C-body platform. But that wasn't going to happen in 1949. GM was already overextended with multiple divisions launching new engines, new bodies, and new technologies. Redesigning a frame mid-year was impossible. So Oldsmobile made a calculated decision. Pull the plug quietly. Don't announce a recall. Don't admit fault. Don't risk damaging the Rocket V8's reputation or the Futuramic design program. Just stop production, stop talking about it, and hope buyers forget. Dealers received discreet communications encouraging them to shift customers toward hardtops and sedans instead. Production numbers were quietly restricted. By the time the 1950 model year arrived, the problem child was simply gone, replaced with an updated structure and revised engineering that avoided the catastrophic weaknesses of the 49 convertible. For customers stuck with one of these flawed convertibles, the experience was a nightmare. Some cars became nearly undrivable after a few years, while others developed body sags so severe that the doors scraped the pavement when opened. Many were jumped long before their mechanical components wore out. Surviving examples today are extremely rare, not because they were collectible, but because so many physically collapsed under normal use. Yet, despite its structural failings, the 1949 Oldsmobile Futuramic 98 convertible still remains historically fascinating. It symbolizes a moment when post-war ambition outpaced engineering caution. GM wanted a futuristic luxury convertible so badly that it overlooked the realities of physics and weight distribution. It was a car built on excitement and optimism, only to collapse under the literal weight of its own design. In a way, the model's quiet cancellation reflects an era before public recalls and transparency were standard. Automakers could bury their mistakes more easily then. Today, a structural flaw of this magnitude would trigger nationwide alerts, lawsuits, and congressional hearings. But in 1949, the fix was simpler: silence, discontinuation, and quiet embarrassment. The 1949 Futuramic 98 convertible is remembered today less as a triumph of design and more as a cautionary tale. It serves as a reminder that not even the most glamorous futuristic styling can compensate for inadequate engineering. The Rocket V8 was powerful, the lines were beautiful, the interior was luxurious, but none of it mattered when the car bent, twisted, and cracked under the basic stresses of driving. Ultimately, Oldsmobile's doomed convertible stands as one of the most dramatic examples of a post-war model that was truly too fragile to live. If you'd like, I can write more 10-minute essays on similar forgotten failures, banned prototypes, and quietly canceled cars.